The African American Civil War Museum is dedicated to 200,000 African American soldiers who joined the Union Army to fight for their freedom in the Civil War. Our exhibit is called Civil War to Civil Rights. That starts with the Civil War and ends with the Civil Rights Movement. And tonight we are honoring a soldier who was in the Civil Rights Movement, Marion, who was the first chairman of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and also was the longest running mayor in the history of Washington, D.C., which is the nation's capital. And his legacy here is important because it ties in very directly with this museum where we're standing tonight, because he was indeed the mayor when we started trying to put this all together. And a good deal of the money that we used to build it with came from the city under his leadership. And 2 or 3 times when we got our tail in a crack and couldn't get enough money, he went and found some money for us. So we owe this to him and also to his legacy. And we'll tell that story here tonight, and we'll tell it not only from my mouth, but from Reginald Green, who was himself a freedom rider in the Civil Rights Movement. He's not just standing here because he's a good-looking, handsome preacher in the District of Columbia. He paid his dues. Mm-hmm. He spent 6 weeks in the Parchment Penitentiary in Mississippi as a civil rights worker, and he's known Marion Barry for years. He was in our housing department when Marion Barry was mayor, and has his own memories of him as mayor and as his boss for the housing departments.
Well, my history happens as a result of the freedom rides, and the year before that, the sit-ins that really catapulted much of what happened. As you look back at how the drama of trying to seek freedom and liberation is an unfolding one.
What year was that?
This was 1961, when I was arrested in Mississippi, along with many names that we all know. One particularly, Marion Barry, who did as much for this city as any one person did in his lifetime here in this community, having come to operate Pride Incorporated. We'll talk some about that later. But Marion gave so much for many reasons. In fact, this museum that Frank has been spearheading and asked me to get involved years ago was a reason why I'm happy to celebrate this night about his life, that is Marion's life, because of what he did to help us salvage and save what others may not have been willing to put money into to make it happen. But what this museum represents is a kind of continuation, evolution of that which starts, and I like to go back to the Civil War soldiers and sailors, those U.S. colored troops who saved this nation, who helped liberate this nation, but opened the door for African Americans to begin to show that we're made of the right stuff. I'm a native Washingtonian. I grew up in this town. I couldn't go to certain schools, and this is not the Deep South. This is South, but not Deep South. We had no signs that said colored only, white only, but there were certain schools we could not go to.
Well, you had no signs.
And that's right. But the law was there. We were run by commissioners, 3 commissioners that operated the city. Frank became part of the council, the school board and the council. And so that's how Frank and I got real close, because I passed it just 3 blocks from where we're located right now. And I had come back home to pass it in my hometown. But I grew up at a time when young African Americans couldn't go to certain schools in the district, but we entertained ourselves. Right. In fact, one of the young men who was part of an entertainment group that we had in junior high school was a fellow named Marvin Gaye. You may have heard of him.
Oh my goodness, he was a part of your group.
He was talking about being a professional singer at 13 years old.
We have to go back to 1968, when Marion Barry, myself, and others are leaving now the Civil Rights Movement. As young kids, we dropped out of college. We spent 4 or 5 years in Mississippi. Now we're ending our careers there, and we want to start our life. We got to go back to school, and we got to build communities, families, and like everybody else now, sort of catch up on the ground, with the ground we left off on. And many of us settled here in Washington, D.C. For 2 reasons. One is because Washington, D.C. is the closest we could get to the Mississippi Delta without getting shot at. And we stayed in Mississippi, we probably would still be being chased by bloodhounds and being shot at. But in Washington, D.C., it was about 70% black, sort of like the Mississippi Delta. People in Washington, D.C. could not vote. They couldn't vote for mayor. They couldn't vote for city council, just like the people in the Mississippi Delta. So it was very similar to the Mississippi Delta, and yet it was the nation's capital, the capital of the country that held out itself as the home of the brave and the land of the free, and where all people were created equal. It held itself out for that all around the world. Sent its army to fight about this all around the world, but right here in the nation's capital, blacks didn't have a right to vote. And a good Baptist preacher once said, if you're going to take a text, you ought to wrestle with it a little bit. So if you're going to live here in the District of Columbia, you ought to try to do something to make it better. So we decided, Mayor Barry decided to run for office here, and at the time there was a lot of SNCC people living here who had come here for the same reason he came.
Right.
We all mostly lived in Ward 1, which I later came to represent on the council and the school board.
Right.
And so it was a good place for us to come. We had a good time here. We got ourselves elected to office, passed groundbreaking legislation creating the Mayor's Summer Youth Institute program here in Washington. You walk the streets of Washington, D.C. now, you see people who are 50 years old who say, Mayor Barry gave me my first job.
That's right. I've heard it
Mayor
several
Barry
times.
helped me get my first house. He helped me get a place for my kid to go to school. And all of those are programs that we had brought with us from the Civil Rights Movement that will now be legislated into law here in the District of Columbia, and we're able to use those things to help uplift our people. And as a result, Washington, D.C. develops the most educated and the most affluent black community in the world, not just in America, but in the world. And some of the richest blacks in the world come out of here. It's a story that ought to be told because we want people to do this everywhere, to find a way to make a difference, to find a way to help those who need help, young people, senior citizens, to help build good schools and good communities. Okay. This is Frank Smith. I'm standing here with a bunch of people from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. I'm going to start with the oldest one in the group, Chuck McDew. Chuck McDew, who became the second chairman of SNCC following Marion Barry. Chuck, tell us what your first image of Marion Barry is. When I say Marion Barry, what do you think of?
That he was a fine brother. And Washington will miss him.
The first time I saw Marion, though, was in 1960, when Marion was chair, because I had come down to volunteer, and they had the first meeting of the coordinating committee.
Now, where was the office there?
Right there in Atlanta, right on Auburn Avenue. Yeah, right.
Cool.
Yeah.
Because the Atlanta Civil Rights
But Marion was on his way to the conventions.
I was a student at Howard. I was in my junior year and had been part of NAG, the Nonviolent Action Group, and Marion opened up an office at First and Rhode Island. That's what I remember. I think it was around 63, maybe 64. I think I was a senior at Howard, and I used to go to the SNCC office and volunteer, and that's where I met Marion and Betty Garmer.
Here in Washington?
Right here in Washington, D.C., and was real active with the O'Roy Chalk. Do you remember that one? Where the public transportation was run by a private company that was run by a man named O'Roy Chalk. And Marion, I think at first was here for SNCC to help raise money for the national effort, but it soon became apparent that there were some local issues that he needed to focus on and that SNCC did as well. So he and Lester McKinney, who is now called Baba Zulu, Lester, or Baba, was his lieutenant, and the two of them, along with Betty Garman, I think were the early leadership of the SNCC office in First and Rhode Island.
Okay, now we have Tim Jenkins with us also. Tim has always been sort of the intellectual, long view thinking, hard-working member of this organization. And Tim, tell us what you've been here, and actually been in Washington, D.C. for all those years. Marion Barry was mayor, too. So you've suffered through all these years, man. What are you thinking about now?
Well, I first encountered Marion in that first freedom school that SNCC had at Fisk University. We gathered together all the sit-in leaders and tried to bring them together for a briefing so they had a broader sense of the history of black people in America. And Marion was in that original group. And we stayed for a month there at Fisk, and we brought in people like Franklin Frazier, Sterling Brown, Rayford Logan, to try and give them some sense of history that was missing from their education, mostly coming from segregated schools in the South. That was when I first met Marion.
From the first meeting, what do you remember?
Well, Marion was one of the people that we were able to recruit when SNCC got at a point of division between nonviolent action and political action. Marion was one of our early recruits for the political side, and he wrote a paper that was some 8 pages typewritten of why we should be involved in political action to strengthen black people. And that paper today gives the chart for his career for the 50 years afterward.
Courtland was actually in the government with Marion for all those years that he was here. Do you remember when you first met him? Tell us what you remember about first meeting. That's what we're trying to figure out here. Who met him first and what he was doing when we first met him?
I met him in SNCC, and I think probably my memories of it, we used to have a big argument about Freedom High and whether you needed to build the organization or build the movement. And Marion was on the side of building the organization, and we were accused, Bob and I were accused of being on the side of building the movement, of being Freedom High. I think a lot of it was, questioning society. What were the actual assumptions of society? That we need to question all of them, or that we need to spend our time building the organization to accomplish things, to get specific things done? And that's, tension in all organizations.
Willie, what do you remember about Marion Barry? When I say Marion Barry, what do you think of?
I think of somebody that brought me up here from Mississippi in 1965 to help organize for something called Home Rule.
Oh, really?
When Africans couldn't vote in Mississippi, they couldn't vote up here in D.C. And Marion organized it, and I came up here and worked with Marion Barry.
The D.C. movement.
The D.C. movement. And I remember Marion Barry, every decision he make, he would call Jim Foreman and ask his opinion about it.
And you and Marion and John Wilson. Because I remember walking across the bridge with you guys.
Featherstone and all of them, yeah. They were all up here. Yes, sir.
This is Betty Garman, Betty came, you actually first came south to work in the office in Atlanta, right?
Exactly.
And I remember you were in there with Julian Bond and those people who were sending out all those press releases.
Exactly.
But what do you remember about Marion Barry? That's who we're talking about here tonight.
Well, some of you know that I knew Marion well.
Yes.
And what I remember mostly was his incredible commitment to the work and to the struggle and his never-ending energy and, that. And then I worked in the D.C. office with him also.
We got the director of the Mississippi Veterans Project called the Veterans of the Civil Rights Movement, of which I am one.
He's one of our board members.
I'm one of the oldest veterans of the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. Cynthia, tell us a little bit about what you know about Marion Barry.
Well, he is going to be remembered for the remarkable work that he did here in D.C., but not just in D.C., but here in Mississippi. He's well loved by the veterans that are still advocating in the state of Mississippi, and we certainly salute him, salute his work. We remember him, and we know that we're better people because of Marion Barry.
I'd like all the people from former SNCC members to please stand up so that can be acknowledged. We love our brother Bukasa, who's always ready for the revolution. I will tell you that Marion would probably enjoy all of this and probably expected it. And in fact, the community would be very displeased if we didn't give him the kind of honor that he deserves. I always think about, on these kinds of occasions where one is asked to sum up one's life, I think about King's statement the night before he was killed, where he said, don't tell them about a PhD. Don't tell them I won the Nobel Prize. but tell them I tried to help somebody. And at the end of the day, if we are to summarize Marion Barry's life, that is what we are to say. He tried to help somebody.